Hello and welcome to Adoptee Conversations from the Adoption and Fostering podcast. In this episode, I chat to Polly, an adult adoptee, and she shares her views and perspectives on adoption. Polly is frank about the challenges she experienced as a result of unsolicited contact from her birth family, as well as the challenge of holding contrasting views of adoption and its processes. Some of the details of her story might be upsetting for listeners who have experience of adoption from whatever perspective, so we advise caution. If there's any doubt, then give it a pass or ask a friend to screen it for you. We hope you find it interesting, and if you're an adoptee and would like to share your perspective or story, then please do direct messages at our Twitter feed or our Facebook page. Hello Polly, it's lovely to speak to you. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm really well, thank you. Could you, it's really kind of you to come and speak on the podcast, but could you give an introduction of yourself? And you know, you're an adoptee, but you tell me who you are and all of that sort of stuff.
All right, so my name is Polly. I live in London. I was adopted in 1982 as a baby, and I've lived in various different places, including various bits of the north, the generic north, Lancashire and Yorkshire, but don't tell either of the other counties that.
Very controversial there.
And London, and also Guernsey. I'll tell you more about that later.
All right. So you really kindly offered to come on and speak to me about your experience of adoption. But I know your story is yours to tell. But how are you feeling about adoption today?
Today, I'm feeling jaded because of a few things that have happened in the last couple of weeks, which is useful to note because it means, I think when you're an adoptee, often you think you've come to terms with it, but it's a never-ending story. So you go through phases of going, oh, this is great now, I've made peace with the bits of it that were bad, and I recognise the bits of it that were good, and then something happens and it totally throws you. And 2 weeks ago, my birth nana died, and she and I only met 4 years ago, and we had an instant bond. And I never had, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but I've met both my birth mum and my birth dad, and I've got sort of a relationship with my birth dad, but not really, but I have got a relationship with my birth mum, but we didn't sort of click, so we've got to know each other, and it's been a bit awkward, and it hasn't been like the TV programs and the fairy tales of my long lost, all of that. And my grandma, on my father's side, was the first person who I met, and I just went, yes, I know where I came from. And it clicked in a way that I had not clicked and hadn't expected to necessarily click with anybody else. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. Why do you think that was?
We're just very, very similar. So my mother and father had very difficult lives, a lot of stuff going on at the time, hence me being adopted. I'm not going to go into it in lots of detail, but my mum already had an older child in care. My dad already had older children, including my older brother, who actually we have both parents in common, so I've got a full brother. And we just didn't have, we had very, very different lives, and we just didn't really have anything in common. And I met my grandma, and my grandma was very adventurous. She was somebody that kind of later in life decided she wanted to learn to fly a plane, so she went and learned to fly a plane. And she wrote poems, and I write poems, and she could sit and tell this sort of shaggy dog story joke that would go on forever and ever and have everybody in fits. And I do stand-up comedy, not as well as she would have done, but I do stand-up comedy. And I met her and just thought, oh my God, this has filled the gap that I never really had that yearning with my adoptive parents of, I need to know where I came from. But when I met her, I went, that's filled that gap I didn't know needed filling. And I was so clear, and I used to write her letters, and I just adored her. And she died, and the reason I'm feeling jaded is I thought, 4 years, I've only had 4 years. Why have I only had 4 years? And I know that's a very selfish way of looking at it, because it's me.
Well, I don't think it is selfish. I think it reflects the kind of that severance, doesn't it? That it's really raw, isn't it?
I never cried at a funeral as much as I cried at her funeral, and I sat kind of 3 rows back, so I was with the family but kind of away from the family. Me and my brother sat, and they were lovely. Like, they said, you must come to the funeral. They were really they welcomed me in with open arms. They've been wonderful. My aunts and my I said, my father is the one I don't really talk to as much, but my aunts and my cousin. But me and my brother, just sort of out of courtesy, really, just kind of sat ourselves a couple of rows back and kind of kept a little bit out the way. And there were just so many complications and things about it that it was just the most difficult, painful, horrible, and everything took on some weird significance. So they played Edith Piaf, Je ne regrette rien, you know, and I thought, God, I regret so much. Like, I am so seething with annoyance and regret. And I know that's silly, that's me reading in, but it was just a really complicated day. I'm just sad. I'm just grieving. That's all. I'm just sad.
Yeah, of course. And it sounds like that. What is a tragic situation anyway? It just seems that these layers that are not necessarily visible to other people, and nuances that other people just may not pick up on.
And kind of not feeling that I could, like when my granny from Yorkshire in my adoptive family died, I adored her as well. Absolutely, just, you know, worshipped the ground she walked on. And so did everybody else. And then at her funeral, I was like, I'm the granddaughter, I'm so sad. And everyone was going, oh my gosh, she was so lovely, you know, and everyone was, I felt like I couldn't do that as the random who hadn't met half the people at the funeral. Yeah. I was being introduced. Oh, this is Polly. Oh, you're the you know, the illegitimate daughter. Kind of, no one said that, but you know, oh yes, we've heard about you. They all said very cryptically, you know.
Yeah.
And I couldn't kind of sob on people and say I'm distraught because this person has died, because I felt like a bit of an upstart, you know. Anyway,
yeah.
That's
no, but that's really interesting, because I've never thought of how that pans out as different people of the family sort of disappear or lost. Wow. And how have your adoptive parents? How do they fit into that? Seeing you grieve for someone that they don't know but is so important to you.
So I think my dad. My adoptive dad has always been absolutely brilliant. He's been so supportive, and he's a very warm, kind of very loving person anyway. And you know, I think when I told him, he was the one that I rang up and went, my grandma's died, and he just went, oh, I'm so sorry. And I actually went to see them last weekend, my parents, before I then went over to this funeral, and they had a bottle of champagne for her, and they said, right, we're going to open a bottle of champagne and we're going to toast your Nana Barbara. So they were really lovely about it. My mum has always, I think, struggled with the birth family, because the birth family found me, which is the other thing I want to talk about, and that was very unexpected. Threw her life upside down, led to some difficulties between her and me.
Right.
Because I don't think she ever expected it to happen. And I think nowadays you might a bit more because of social media and all that. I was adopted back in 1982. I think it was very much, you know, not something she would expect. She made a comment when I said, right, I'm going over for the funeral, which was, oh, why are you going to the funeral? She didn't understand. She genuinely didn't, you know, she was like, you don't really know this person. I said, but I do. I've got to know this person. And I think she just didn't identify with that. I don't think she wasn't being mean. Mm-hmm. Whereas my dad, who I think, you know, knows me really, really well as well, and is a very similar person to me emotionally, and his response was, oh, I'm so sorry, because I booked a flight. She lives in the Channel Islands. I booked a flight to go and see her, and she died the day after I'd booked the flight, and I was due to go the day after that. So I missed her by like 24 hours.
Oh, it's heartbreaking.
And I'd booked to go and say goodbye.
Wow.
Sorry, I'm going to be useless at this interview.
That's okay. It's okay. Just take a minute.
I'm sorry. I'm a really soppy person anyway. That's just.
I mean, you reflect in that one story, which is really raw, clearly. You reflect a whole host of things which I think sometimes people, that idea that, but why are you bothered about this person you've never met? Yeah. And on an intellectual level, people are why? Yeah. But we're not talking about intellect, are we?
No, and I think it was also, I think people don't understand. I think there's two schools of thought, and I never, until I met her, really fell into either of them. And one is, oh, you always desperately yearn for these people because of the biology. And I never really had that, and I put that down to the fact I was adopted as a baby, And then when I met them, to be honest, we didn't have much in common. It was nice. It filled in some gaps. It's been interesting. I have been able to have a relationship with my mother, which I'll talk about probably later on, that's been difficult but important. And then there's the other school of thought, which is clean break, which is the thought they had in the 80s. Yeah. And this is one of the issues I have with adoption, this idea, and I love adoption, I really do. I have the most amazing experience. I don't love aspects of the bureaucracy. I don't like the fact that I could never see my birth certificate. I don't like the fact that when I was born, I call her my birth mum just to make it easier. My birth mum gave me a name. She gave me a name, and then my name was on my file, which I got to see when I was 32. But my parents changed my name because they didn't get told things like that, and that to me seems
right.
Because I was a baby, and then the children's home had given me a different name. So my mum had called me Kelly Marie. So my file said Kelly Marie. The children's home called me Carla because I was like the third baby born that year, ABC. That was the name. So then my parents were like, well, we'll give the baby a new name. And they called me Polly, which is a great name, but they would have kept, say, the Marie.
Yeah.
Particularly because I'm Catholic, and it would have worked completely, Yeah.
That's really emotive stuff, isn't it? That's really, it's really linked to identity and who you are, and that it's a real tangible link to your birth mum.
Who you become when you are adopted should not negate who you were. This idea that your history, particularly if you're adopted as a baby, gets wiped out. My life doesn't start until I'm 3.5 months old, effectively, in terms of bureaucracy or anything, really. I mean, there's no photos, there's no nothing until I got taken home. My parents made up for it, but there's about 10 albums of baby photos afterwards. But, those are these two extremes of adoption, this idea that you yearn for this sort of family, and then this idea that you have this clean break and you become a completely different person. And neither of those, in my personal experience, some people will have one or other of those. To me, that wasn't realistic.
Yeah.
I can't remember where I was going with that now, sorry.
No, it's okay. I mean, I feel like in some ways I've hoodwinked you because I didn't start at the beginning, did I?
No, you're all right.
So, I mean, can we start at the beginning? I mean, what's your experience of kind of growing up as an adoptee? Did you know you were adopted? Do you have...
Yeah. So my parents did some really good things that I know not everybody's parents did, particularly in those days, which I'm eternally grateful for. So I was adopted... my adoption was arranged before I was born. So my birth mum, had 2 children.
Right.
I was the second. So she had one child who was already in care. He eventually grew up in foster care, having been in and out of different homes and all sorts. So he had a very kind of chaotic childhood. And I was lucky, I think, by dint of being baby number 2, the authorities basically went, we're going to take this baby. Now, my mother signed the paperwork. She did agree to me being adopted, and she said to me since, I wanted to keep you, but I couldn't look after you. And she wasn't coerced into it. She did come to that decision. She said to me she came to that decision, but she was very much encouraged to, it's a bit two-sided,
with hindsight you can look back and go, what choices did she have, and you can ask all those difficult questions.
She couldn't let me. She at the time didn't have an address. My file said she found it very difficult to build and maintain relationships. She'd had, which I'm not going to go into, but an awful, very complicated childhood and a very complicated life. She had a violent partner. He, who eventually went to prison, spent some time in prison. There was a lot of. It's actually a very common. I think you'll probably know more about this than me because you're a social worker. But it sounds like quite a common story. It wasn't massively melodramatic. It was just, So they decided I would be adopted. Now I didn't go home until I was 3.5 months old because I had to stay in hospital for the first few months after I was born, just because of some health issues that I had. But my parents, I don't remember ever being told I was adopted, which I think is great. It was just something I always knew. So there was never a moment where they sat me on a sofa and said, now we've got this thing to explain. So that when I was a kid, I celebrated 2 birthdays because I celebrated the day they brought me home as well as my actual birthday. So when I went to school, I remember being in reception class and they said, when is your birthday? And I said, I've got 2 birthdays. And all my friends said, you can't have 2 birthdays. And I said, well, I have, because I didn't understand at that age why. And I knew I was adopted. And my cousin used to say adoperated. So, as they do. But it was always sort of normalised in a way. They didn't want me to ever find out or think it was anything particularly abnormal or anything like that. So that's the first thing that I think was the right thing to do. Second thing that I think was the right thing to do was they never vilified either of my parents or their experience or anything. So my dad, again, particularly, was always very, very keen to say, well, she was obviously a very brave person. She was obviously a very good person. She did what was best for you. She carried you, she gave birth to you. She kind of relinquished you when you were a baby. And as I got older, they explained, well, you could have been in and out of care and then forced into adoption much later. But because you're married to do that, it ended up being best for you. So he always made sure, my dad particularly, that he painted her in a light whereby if and when I met her, I would only have good feelings for her. And I know adopted people who've been told, well, your mother was terrible and that's why you had to be adopted because she was a terrible person. And my mum, like most people, was not a good or a bad person. She was a victim of circumstance. She was in that place at that time, and I have never, ever had any ill feeling to her at all. And I think I would be cross now if I'd been brought up to do so, if that makes sense.
Well, that's a great message, and that's really encouraging, because I think that's what I encourage people to do. And I'm sure that's not universally what happens, but you would aspire to actually make your own mind up when you eventually meet them.
Absolutely, and they always allowed me to do that, which I thought was really good. So then I grew up, I was an only child. Turns out later I wasn't an only child, but I thought I grew up as an only child, which was a little bit lonely. So I would have been nice to have had siblings, but I had a lot of cousins and people around me. The only issue I do have on the flip side of that, which is why I'm interested in a lot of stuff you do on the podcast and work like Beth Neal's work, things like that, is I was given absolutely no information. So on the one hand, my parents said, well, if you want to, when you're older, you can find stuff out. But I didn't have a basis upon which to make that decision. So I agonised over whether I wanted to, and there were too many what ifs. What if she has her own family? What if she was the victim of rape? Right. And I found out something like that. I went to counselling when I was at university to decide whether to search or not. And because of all the unknowns, I decided not to. Now, my parents always told me that they didn't know anything. And that turned out not to be true. They actually knew. Yeah. And they did what they thought was right at the time. They said they were given, it was 1982, they weren't given any guidance. They didn't have a social, after they took me home, it was like, here's your baby, off you go, and off they went with their baby, and no problems, no follow-up, no nothing. And they were told, she's adopted as a baby, therefore this is it, she'll grow up like this is her new life, end of. So my parents didn't tell me anything, and I've raised this with my mum since, and my mum said, oh, well, you were always very clear that you didn't want to know. And I said, but if you knew stuff, and then she said to me once, you never asked the right questions, like it's the crystal maze or something. And I thought, well, I didn't know what questions to ask. You always said to me, oh, we didn't really know anything, and that turned out not to be true. And if I'd been told, well, we know a little bit, what is it you want to know, and we'll tell you if we know it or not, because then it would still have been my decision to go, did you know why my mother, did you know any names, and there was some of that they would have said, look, we know this, but we don't know this. How old were you when this kind of came to light? Let me see, where do I go with this? So shall I tell you what happened with my brother? That's probably the easiest. Yeah. So basically, this all went on. I did have a nice chat with my dad just before I got married. I suddenly thought, but I kind of want to find stuff out because I'm going to get married. And I always worried. That there was this person. I always thought about my mother. I didn't really think about, I didn't know whether there was anyone else around. You don't know. I mean, particularly, my father, I thought he might have been somewhat temporary. There's a lot, there's kind of a certainty about mums, but dads. Yeah, exactly. I mean, she can't stick around for at least 9 months, right? So I worried about her. I worried that there might be some poor woman somewhere who might have been, 14 years old or whatever, and be forced to give a baby up, or they were or she might have been raped, or she might have been this, she might have been that. And I worried years and years and years. I worried about, what if there's this poor person, and what if they think she thinks I hate her, which I don't, or she thinks I resent her, which I don't. And actually, when I finally met her, I got to kind of say all those things and say, I love you and I don't have any hard feelings. And she did. She felt really guilty because she knew nothing about me. One of the things that it turned out she'd done, which is my other problem with adoption in those days, less so now because now they have letterbox adoptions. She wrote to the agency when I was 3 and she said, can I have a photo of my daughter, and can I have some information, is she all right? And they just said, go away. And my lovely dad, my adoptive dad, said they never rang us. They never if they'd contacted us and said, look, she'd like to just know if her daughter's all right. And this was the days before the internet. Actually, a photo wouldn't have been, and I was living about 200 miles away. And my dad said, my God, we'd have sent her an album. We wouldn't have just sent her one picture. Of course we would. Of course we'd have told her. And that makes me, my bristle with rage when I think of anybody doing that to somebody. It feels to me like them continuing to punish somebody for not living up to society's ideals. Well, you screwed up with this child, so now you can suffer. What the hell? What would have been wrong with saying, yeah, she's fine? Because actually the agency sent us a Christmas card every year. They still knew where we lived. They still... And that's my other thing. Sorry, you might need to edit this and put it in some kind of vague semblance of order.
No, it's fine.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine, because I can see where you're going, and I can see that obviously there's loads of...
Yeah,
it's all interlinked and it's all interwoven. But you were sort of talking about... You were going to talk about your brother, but before that you were talking about this idea that you had all of these questions. And so prior to you getting married, I'm just interested, who held that with you? Because you've got all these questions. Was it an isolating experience, or were you open with people?
I've always been very open because I've talked too much, as you can probably tell. And adoption, actually, when I was a kid, adoption was something that, because it was sort of very much sold to me as a positive thing, which it was, because I had amazing parents. We had a dog and a cat, and I had all these hobbies. So my life was great, and adoption for me was always a very positive thing. So it was something I told people because it wasn't anything to be worried about or ashamed about or anything like that. As I got into my teenage years and kind of understood a bit more what it was, girls at school started to say things like, oh, why didn't your mother want you? And again, that's teenage girls. Teenage girls are horrible. And they were either being nasty, or sometimes they just didn't know how to phrase a question. I had my cousin's little girl a couple of years ago said to me, so were your parents inbred? And I said, you know what, that's not really the word you want to be using there. So people asked me stuff, and I had, oh, why didn't your mother want you? Why couldn't she look after you? And I realised that A, I didn't have the answers to those questions, and B, that actually adoption wasn't necessarily a good in inverted commas, that it was a complicated thing. And I think what I feel now that I have found everything out, which I'll come to, I've been back to counselling, because I went to a counsellor over all of this, but that didn't really, I guess it kind of helped, but I couldn't get answers from anywhere except my file, and I was too scared to go and look at my file until I was forced into it as a much older person.
Just before you got married?
So no, it was actually after I got married. So I decided not to look. My dad said, if you ever want to, we will support you. So I kind of put it to bed and thought, okay, you know what, I'm happy as I am. It's a bit of a blind spot, but on balance, that's all right, because I didn't want to cause any harm. I didn't want to turn up on a doorstep and somebody say, shit, I've actually got 4 kids and a husband and I haven't told anyone about you. So I thought, okay.
Which happens, exactly. Well, so what then happened to me, so I then kind of had that happen to me, which almost made me think I've made the right decision, because I got an email in my work inbox one night saying, dear Polly, this may sound a bit odd, but I think I'm your brother. And that was the first time that I even knew I had a brother. Now, what then happened is, so I phoned my poor mum, my adoptive mum, and said, have I got a brother? Which was a bit unfair, because it caught her a little bit off guard. To the point,
but
isn't it?
I was reading this thing, and I said, have I got a brother? And she kind of fumbled a little bit, and I read this email to her, And she said, oh, no, you definitely haven't got a brother. Oh, I'll go away and I'll have a think. She knew a little bit. She didn't know loads, to be fair to her, but she knew a little bit. And she, I think, in the 80s had thought, this is all not very nice. You know, she certainly don't want to tell her kids some of the stuff I later found out. Yeah. And as I got older, she thought, oh, well, water under the bridge. She doesn't really want to find out. And suddenly she was confronted, my poor mum, with, apparently I've got a brother. How about that? But wow. So she then came up on the phone and she came up with this strange, well, I think actually it sounds like he's put 2 and 2 together and made 5, and he was one of the foster kids of this person that we vaguely knew, and that's why. Now, I'll tell you what had actually happened, because this is also a thing that makes me cross. What happened was he had been fostered long-term in the end by the social worker that had arranged my adoption. Now, my adoptive mum had kept in touch with the social worker, I think partly just out of pride on my mum's part, because my file had described my parents as, in the 80s, educationally subnormal, which I think is a vile phrase. Don't even get me started.
Yeah.
That was the phrase. That was on my file. ESN, educationally subnormal. And it said, which is awful, and it said that I was expected to have a lot of special needs, and it was good that I was going to a family where I would be the only child because they could give me a lot of care. So every time I did something vaguely good, so I got into the National Youth Choir, my mum would write a letter to this social worker saying, Polly's done this, and they would exchange Christmas cards and they would do all of this sort of stuff. Now, this is where I feel the social worker, went wrong. You can tell me, but I'm assuming this is a massive breach of data, because she had told her daughter, oh, this is Lee's sister. So when she died, the daughters got together and decided to pass all this information on to my brother and said, I think you want to contact this person, this is your sister. They decided to do to me what I decided not to do to my mother, which was just out of the blue. No, didn't go via the agency, didn't go via an intermediary, nothing. Didn't let me choose whether I was contacted or when I was contacted, just sent me an email out the blue. And to me, that's a sort of Pandora's box, because there's no way after that you can go, oh, you might be my brother, but you're all right, I'll just stay as I am, thank you very much.
Just leave it, yeah.
We'll just leave it there, it'll be fine. I didn't feel like I had a choice.
It set a ball in motion that no one could stop, really.
And I spoke to one of the sisters a couple of weeks ago, just after my nana died, and she and I know each other now, but I didn't realise this is what had happened. And she said to me, oh, we just assumed you wanted to be found. And I am still kind of seething with rage about that, because I didn't want to be found. And this is something that I haven't said on some of the interviews I've done about happy, you know.
Yeah.
I don't want to be found. I'm not a lost kitten. And I had my family and I had my life, and this threw it into absolute chaos. And it was not fair. And I think now, if I'd had more information, which you would do nowadays, it wouldn't be so much of a shock. It wouldn't have been as much of a problem. But given the fact that I didn't have any of that information, I then had to request, because I sent him like a holding email. I actually got my husband to write to him and go, hello, I'm Polly's husband. She's in shock right now. We're gonna request her file and look into this, and we'll get back to you. So I requested my file. The agency had changed its name by then, and they said, oh, you know, this is very unorthodox, this isn't how it works. I said, look, can you just, I just see my file, please. Took them 6 weeks to get this file. I had to, So I went and read this file, and I went from knowing nothing to knowing that my mother had given me a name, which broke my heart. Absolutely broke my heart. It is the single most sad moment of my life to be given this file that said Kelly Marie on it and go, who's Kelly Marie? Oh, that was your name. I was like, what do you mean that was my name? And I don't have the words. This was like 5 years ago. I do not have the words for the pain that I felt.
And that's just even the first page. You must have just been overwhelmed. And
it was awful. And I then opened it up, and it didn't have very much. There was lots that was redacted. It had other people involved. But, I saw my hospital records, and it said the other thing that broke my heart, and this is, again, coming back to problem number 2 with adoption, which is how the mother is treated. It said, mother wished for Kelly Marie to be adopted. Mother has never seen her. And when I met my mum, I said, did you actually genuinely not see me? She said, no, they took you away straight away. They wouldn't let me, they didn't want me to bond with you because they thought that would be bad for me and bad for you, so they took you away. And again, I know that wouldn't happen now, and there's so much research to show that is horrendous for a baby as well.
Yeah.
To be taken, delivered, and then taken off and put in an incubator or whatever, as it happened with me, because I was very, very small when I was born for, again, health issues. She wasn't even allowed to look. I mean, who does that to a woman? I don't care what you've done. I don't care what's going to happen in the future. You do not do that to a woman and a newborn baby. It's just,
yeah.
I know that might have been the thinking in 1982, but I can't.
You would have thought that, if you'd have said this in 1952, I'd have gone, 1962, but 1982, no, just barbaric. It's always barbaric, but
exactly.
You'd have hoped to be more enlightened.
Those are my issues. So I'm kind of putting it all in different boxes because I have no problem. My adoption and my adoptive parents, brilliant. The way that adoption was done and the way I then was found like I was some discarded, lost toy, awful. Yeah.
There's no other words for it, really, is there? And I see that you're holding these two complicated things in tension. In the middle of all that, there's these people.
Yes. Yeah, and that's been so hard. And I think one of the things that's been impossible to navigate, when I went and read my file, I didn't tell my parents because I kept raising this issue with my mum, and she kept, as in my adoptive, she kept saying, oh, well, I don't think you've got a brother. And then eventually she said, oh, well, you might have a brother, but what's going to happen if, you've got lots of qualifications and he might not have any, and how's he going to feel? I said, well, he found me, so that's kind of not my problem. And I felt like she was trying to get me to not look, and I thought, this is not my fault. Someone else has found me. This bit has been done for me. It's too late.
Yeah. Like you said, it's Pandora's box. It's exactly. Happened.
Exactly. But then I feel like I've spent a lot of time since then, because of course, so what I did then, I went and I met my brother, but of course that then opens, because he was fostered, not adopted, he was in touch with our mother and our father, and then all these cousins and all of these other people. So I went from having one lovely family that I really got on with. I'm so close to my family, my adopted family, who are my family.
Yeah.
Suddenly I had all these other people that I didn't really know what to do with, and I now am in a position, well, not so much now, but I feel like I've always been treading carefully because I would hate to hurt my adoptive parents. I was very, very anxious about that. And I felt that suddenly going and meeting all these people might do, even if they said, oh, no, of course you can do. And my dad was always very out. I'll tell you, one of the most special moments in my life was this Christmas just gone. I Skyped my birth mum on Christmas Day, and I passed the computer to my dad, and my dad had a little chat conversation with her. And she said to him, oh, she's done ever so well. Haven't you done well bringing her up? And my dad said, but we've only got her because of you. Didn't you do well, bringing her into the world? And thank you for everything you've done. And that was so nice. But that is what now, I know there are some families, and I know it doesn't always work like that because it's complex, but I know of some families where that happens much earlier on, where there's that understanding from the start of these two parts of your life that are both important but different. And I know there's a tension there, but it was very hard to do that at kind of 36.
Yeah, and you hadn't asked to do that, so it's not like you'd spent years preparing, and it was very much you were put on that roller coaster and someone pressed go.
Yeah.
I'm really interested by that, inhabiting these two worlds, like this Venn diagram of your life. Whereas you are the touch point for these two communities, and you're trying to keep them both happy. And so, from your brother, what was that experience of sort of moving out into this new world of these blood relatives?
It was awkward because I think, and this is something I've talked about a little bit online, I get quite annoyed by some of these TV programs that obviously really simplify it because they've only got an hour to make these. There's a lot of these programs, and my sister-in-law had watched all these programs and encouraged my brother to find me because she said family is very, very important to her. She was the one that sort of encouraged him to do that. But they present a very two-dimensional view often, and you see people going, oh, I've wondered about you all my life, and then they embrace, and it's all, but it's usually happy ever after. And I am very annoyed at the view that the public have as a result of that. I'll give you another example. A few years ago, a good friend of mine shared a post on Facebook of somebody saying, I'm looking for my sibling, and the last thing I knew about her was this and this and this and this. And she shared this saying, please help this person find their sister. And I emailed her privately and said, look, this person might not want to be found.
Yeah.
And she replied to me, oh, but it all worked out well for you in the end. I thought, well, it didn't actually. And also that is not somebody else's call to me. And she actually argued. She argued and argued with me, and then said, well, I don't think we're going to agree on this. And I thought, no, we're bloody not going to agree.
No, that'll be a no then.
She might want to. And then she said, well, you don't know if this person wants to be found or not, so you're not in a position to say. And I said, but if she doesn't,
yeah,
if she does and it doesn't happen, well, she can try to search. If she doesn't, you're going to, because I almost had a breakdown. I ended up, I don't know how much detail to go into here, but it spiraled into so much stuff all in one go, from knowing nothing to having all these people, to being quite upset with my adoptive mum because she had, with the best intentions, sort of withheld bits of info that might have, and it might have made the same. I'd have probably said, I still don't want to find anything out. I'm quite happy, thank you. But it means it wouldn't have been as much of a shock. And then I had my brother, who I met, who is lovely, by the way. So my friend is right in that it did work out, but I got so overwhelmed, I considered suicide. Like, really seriously thought about, and that to me was scary and alien and weird, and I was, the sensible bit of my brain was sensible enough to go, no, come on, that's taking it too far. But I went on antidepressants, which I've sort of come off but then gone on again, and it kind of, I love all the people in my life dearly, but I don't like the way that things happened. And that's partly down to the authorities, meaning that we didn't know stuff at the time, the fact there wasn't letterbox adoption, the fact that there wasn't all of this, some of the stuff I found out which caused me a lot of pain, like the way they treated my mother, and then the fact that other people, this is the problem a lot of adoptees have, other people make decisions for them. The one person that never gets a say in a lot of stuff, I feel, not never, but is the adoptee. And I am very, very pleased and happy that I was adopted, and I'm a big, I'm described on Adoption UK's website as a poster child for adoption because I did, which is a bit, but because I did very well as a result of it, and I had a loving family and security that I wouldn't have had otherwise. But it doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of improvements that could be made. And it disappoints me sometimes that I will see stuff that happened in 1982 that is still not resolved in 2019. Do you see what I mean?
The same issues, maybe outworked a different way, but the same fundamental issues. Yeah. I mean, that leads me to the next question, really, which is what do you see for the future of adoption? What if you could, because you talk to some adoptees and they would say, full stop, it needs to end.
No, you see, I don't agree with that at all. I think we need to acknowledge that adoption, by definition, comes out of sadness or trauma or something going wrong. You wouldn't want to go back to the 60s where somebody goes, oh, you're an unmarried mother, that's it, we're taking your baby away. That idea of shaming, of course. But I think adoption is a good thing. I've had arguments online with people, and I know it's very different in different countries. Like, I have some issues with how it works in the US, for example. I have a lot of friends in the US, and the idea that you pay a lot of money to get a baby, and the way it seems to work over there, whereas I know that over here it is more likely children in care where something has gone wrong, and they've looked at other options like kinship carers, and it's a really great last resort. And it shouldn't necessarily always be a last resort. There was a programme a few years ago that had a lady on it who'd chosen to give her baby up, which was really sad, but kind of positive, negative at the same time, I thought. And again, you may know more about that and have a different view being a social worker. I'm looking at it again very two-dimensionally, so I know that. I would never end adoption, but I would make it less bureaucratic, and I would have certain rules in place. I would have more follow-up. Now, there probably is more now, but I know from groups that I'm in, a lot of adoptive parents saying we were totally lost. And I know of people who've basically given their kids back into care because they can't cope. And that is, must be devastating for the kids. That must be the end of the world, because they've basically been rejected then twice. I can't imagine.
Catastrophic.
Yeah, I cannot imagine that. So I think there needs to be more in terms of ground rules. My parents actually said to my dad the other day, well, were you not given any advice for what to do if people turn up, and found me? And my dad said, well, no, because in those days they weren't allowed to. And I said, well, I don't think my brother was supposed to now, but he did it through the back door, over the internet on his own.
So there's clearly lots of things that kind of from a process point of view that don't fit, but that they also bleed into the ethics of the process, don't they, as well?
I mean, you've got to be very careful. I mean, I've sort of, on the one hand, of course, you don't want to go back to a situation where you're taking babies away from perfectly competent mothers just because there's no support for them.
Yeah.
On the other hand, and this might be controversial and you may disagree, but I do sometimes think we almost go the other way sometimes and are so desperate to keep parents and children together because of that idea of biology, that there are kids almost like my brother actually at the time who were in and out of care and actually had a more chaotic upbringing because they were trying to maintain a relationship that wasn't maintainable. Do you know what I mean? I think being adopted as a baby, for all the ethical issues, was much better for me and easier for my parents in the long run, because it meant they did get a baby and I grew up and that was all I knew.
Your voice, sorry to talk across you, but
no,
I was going to say your voice is quite unique in that there's a lot of, as an adoptee, you seem very pragmatic.
I think that's a compliment. Thank you.
No, I think pragmatism is a much undervalued, because I like to think I'm a pragmatic, but in the sense that you're able to hold both arguments and find some middle ground. But I don't see much of that online very much.
No, I like it. That's why I've had arguments with people, because they've put me in a camp, one or the other. They'll take one comment I've put, oh, well, you obviously adore adoption, think it's the most wonderful thing in the world, and I'll say, no, I think my experience worked, and these were the things that worked, and then these were the things that weren't, and it didn't,
Yeah. And so do you find yourself, are there like-minded adoptees like yourself? Is there a collective? Do you have a community? Do you have support?
Not well. There's one person who I originally met online. It turned out that she lives quite near me, so she's up in North London, and she and I met up, and it turned out we'd had a very similar experience. So we both had perfectly fine and happy childhoods, but there were issues, and they were often around communication and openness and all of those things. We're a similar age as well, and that was really cathartic and nice. And again, neither of us were, oh, we hate adoption. I look at my life, and I look at my brother's life and other people that I know, and I realise that I'm extremely lucky, even just on paper. I've got a master's degree, I've had all this security, I've done things that I would not have been able to do if I had grown up with my parents. And I don't mean that sounds awful, because I feel like I'm basically saying, well, I got to grow up middle class, but it's more than that. It's about security and consistency and love, and actually material things, which, and that's a whole other problem with society. That's a problem with non-adoptees, growing up in poverty and growing up with, without a stable home and having to move a lot and all of that sort of thing. Where was I going with that sentence? I'm sorry, I keep going off on tangents.
No, it's really interesting. But even when you were saying that, you said I got to grow up like this and this and this. I'm conscious that there's a lot of voices that say that's like an argument that is used against people who are against adoption.
Yeah,
almost. But that's your experience.
And that's why I'm always very careful. I try online to be very careful to say I am talking about my experience, because I can't speak for other people's experience, but I can look at me and I can look at other members of my family and how other people have turned out, and realize that is a product of the things that have gone wrong. Often is a product of the pain and the insecurity that they've experienced. I mean, that said, the flip side, one of the counsellors that I did see when my brother found me and I kind of went into a bit of a black hole, said that I had survivor guilt, because basically I looked at these other people, because I have other siblings, half siblings that I've now, it's complicated. There are other people.
Pandoras box.
Yeah, indeed. So back to that. But I realised I had done better, in massive inverted commas, as in literally talking about qualifications and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I think that is because of the level of stability. That's the word I was looking for, more than security. That I had stability. That my brother, for example, going in and out of care, and he had amazing foster parents and talks very highly of them, but it wasn't until he was that little bit older. Mm-hmm. And I had a much more stable upbringing, which I think in my personal case was the right outcome.
Yeah. The police are coming to get you. Are you okay? It's the adoption police. You've said too much.
I've said the wrong thing.
You have. Twitter police are coming to get you. So in some ways that brings us, I started at how do you feel about adoption today? And I guess that's a good way of bookending it. So in light of all that, you describe yourself as a poster girl for adoption. You're very vocal. So is it something that you feel you're going to continue to be open about? And
I think so. I think the reason that I do the volunteering for Adoption UK is because I'm somebody who can speak out, who has had a good experience, which there's an element to which that's what adoptive parents and people want to see. I want people to say, I could adopt. I can do this because look at this person who of this. Look at me.
Could we have a Polly, please?
No, but because I am able to say that I've had a positive experience, but the flip side of that is I can also reflect on the things that haven't been as positive in the hope I can help to change them. And I think, it's very kind of you to say I'm pragmatic, but actually it's hopefully a useful. I think there are a lot of people who've had terrible experiences, who are perhaps, I don't want to say they're biased, but there's a lot of people that are coming at it from they have a bone to pick with it, or they think it's the most wonderful thing in the world ever, end of. And I think being found the way I was found, finding out things about my family, finding them out at the stage that I did, has made me, it's allowed me to be pragmatic and go, this was great, this was not so great. If I was adopted now, or if I adopted now, I would be more open with my children about where they came from and what their background was, and being careful on the internet. Again, never occurred to me, because when I was actually born and going through that, there wasn't the internet. So so I think that's why I would still, and I will say this to people online, I do say this to people online, I'm still very much, I don't feel like you can be pro or anti-adoption, because every single person is an individual. And what annoys me is getting grouped in, or when my friend said, oh, well, this person might want to be found and it all worked out for you, and putting me in that box of I've watched Long Lost Families and it all works out for the good in the end. We're all individuals. You're an individual, I'm an individual. There might be somebody for whom a letterbox adoption will work. There might be somebody else for whom it really won't because of abuse or whatever. I hate this one size fits all that we try and do in society to everybody all the time.
There's no one truth, is there?
No, absolutely. And my experience as a child was different to my experience when suddenly I got that email in my inbox. And that was different to my experience when my nana died and I realised how heartbroken I was about this person that I'd only known a few years. My experience is constantly changing.
Yeah, and there's a quote by Dr. John Rabel that post-adoption support is a misnomer. Adoption is an event. It's not an event. It's an experience that unfolds over a lifetime.
Absolutely. And I don't feel there is enough support really or enough understanding of the complexities for adoptees. And I think I've also had people online, or I've seen them talking to other people who are complaining, and I've seen people come and say to them, well, you should be grateful. And you think, but nobody gets told, oh, you should be grateful for what you've ended up with. My husband, who's not adopted, I don't think he's ever been told, well, you should be grateful for being born and having parents. but I'm told, and other people online are told, they should be grateful. Now I'm incredibly grateful for my parents. That's not because they're my adoptive parents. I'm grateful for them because they're lovely people who brought me up. My dad is my best mate in the world. My mum is the person I ring up when I'm having a bad day and everything's gone wrong. That's why I'm grateful for them, not because they happen to adopt me rather than give birth to me. Does that make sense?
Because of what you've got with them, that
exactly.
Relationship. Yeah.
Exactly. And I don't want to be defined by being adopted, even though, okay, I shout about the label, obviously, because I do this, but this again, this two-dimensional approach, you should be happy, you should be sad, you should be this, you should be that. Nobody has that.
Yeah. And you reserve the right to change your mind.
Absolutely. And I reserve my right more to be happy or unhappy with the nuances of the experience. Adoption is not a one thing. You are adopted, that's it.
Yeah, so I suppose now you as a woman, in your 30s, you're now, the last few weeks have then given you a whole new experience that has totally transformed your overall experience. Yeah, it really, really has, in a good way and a bad way, because in one sense I realised how connected I was to people or to some of those people. Yeah. My cousin Jess has become one of my best friends, and we're very, very similar. And she sort of looked after me at the funeral, which was lovely. Anyway, I'm rambling. No, I mean, it's been a really fantastic to chat, and I'm aware I'm taking up all your time on a Sunday night. No, I'm taking up yours. I talk too much. I'm sorry. No, honestly, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat to you, and so thank you very much for coming on the podcast. And I think people will find that really, really interesting and insightful, and hopefully give people a lot to think about. Hope so. Okay. Well, look after yourself, and I shall speak to you soon. Thank you. Yep. Talk to you soon. Bye. Bye.